They said the Holloways had money older than the town itself, and a kind of silence thicker than snow that always clung to their estate. Holloway House, perched atop a crooked hill where the trees never quite shed their leaves, and the wind always seemed to whisper in half-syllables. Jeremiah Holloway, a stern man of rigid posture and coal dark eyes, had inherited not just the timber mill and the land beneath it, but also a bloodline soaked in secrets no generation dared speak aloud. His wife, Esther, was younger by nearly 15 years, pale as linen, with the kind of fragile beauty that made people wonder whether she was meant for this world at all. She rarely spoke in town, only nodded when greeted, and was often seen wandering the edges of the forest in thin shawls, barefoot, murmuring things to herself that not even the wind carried back. When it was announced she was with child, no one celebrated. There were no gifts, no chatter at the local grocer, no knitting circles preparing baby blankets. The town held its breath, for they remembered what had happened to Jeremiah's sister. 2 miscarriages, 1 infant born without eyes. But Esther carried well, or so it seemed, until that fateful December night in 1867, when the snow fell like ash and the sky turned an unholy shade of violet. The midwife, Ruth Hembley, had been delivering children in Vermont for 30 years and had long since hardened to the shrieks and groans of laboring mothers. But she'd never seen a house like Holloway's. Too quiet, too cold, the walls soaked with an unnatural stillness that pressed against her skin like damp wool. Esther's cries didn't sound like pain. They sounded like something clawing its way out of the grave. Hours passed in a blur of blood and sweat, until 2 identical baby boys slipped into the world, blue-lipped and utterly silent. Ruth cleaned them, swaddled them, and waited for breath, for twitch, for the unmistakable cry of the living. But none came. Their little fingers curled stiffly, their eyes never opened, and their skin already held a sheen that Ruth, against her better judgment, described as too smooth to be natural. She whispered a prayer, pressed her hand to Esther's arm, and with a trembling voice delivered the truth. Both twins were stillborn. Esther stared at them for a long, motionless moment, then let out a wail that seemed to rise not from her throat but from the deepest well of the earth itself. Then she stopped, dead silent, and spoke a phrase Ruth would never forget. Not because she understood it, but because it made her bones feel cold from the inside out. The syllables were harsh, wet, guttural, like a chant spoken underwater, as though it didn't belong to any human tongue. Ruth stepped back. Jeremiah entered the room without knocking, looked at the twins, looked at his wife, and without a flicker of emotion said, "We'll take care of it." He dismissed Ruth with full payment, double, in fact, and insisted she never speak of what happened. She didn't argue. She left the Holloway estate that night barefoot, her boots left inside the birthing room, and she never practiced again. Back in town, when people asked, she only shook her head and said, "They weren't born wrong. They were born wronged." Over the next week, odd things began to happen. A grave was dug behind the chapel. Twin plots marked Holloway, but no funeral, no gathering. The plots were never filled, but the soil was disturbed, then smoothed again each morning, as though something beneath the surface refused to stay still. People started hearing crying at night, not just from the Holloway estate, but from the woods nearby, soft and layered, like two infants wailing in harmony. Jeremiah returned to town once, bought 2 identical cribs from the carpenter, and oared, red lace blankets and rocking horses. When asked about the twins, he simply said, "They're resting." A servant from the house, a young girl named Mary Beth, ran off screaming one morning, her hair tangled with twigs, her face scratched as though she'd run blind through the trees. When questioned, she repeated one sentence over and over until she passed out. "They don't blink." Meanwhile, Esther became a ghost in her own home. Neighbors reported seeing her in the nursery window, rocking 2 invisible bundles, whispering lullabies offbeat, always offbeat, as though following a rhythm only she could hear. When a local priest, Father Gillespie, was summoned to bless the house, he stayed exactly 13 minutes before emerging drenched in sweat, his crucifix burned into the palm of his hand, muttering that nothing inside that room is asking for God. He left the town that same week, abandoning his post. Inside Holloway House, time did not move the way it should. The nursery clock always stopped at 2:07 a.m., the exact time Ruth had pronounced the babies dead. Fresh milk left by the door was always taken. Tiny fingerprints began appearing on fogged glass, even when no children were present. Visitors were forbidden, though a peddler once snuck inside seeking shelter during a blizzard. He returned to town days later, silent and gray-haired, unable to speak, with his tongue cleanly severed and wrapped in lace. When the sheriff investigated, he found the nursery doors nailed shut, but the sound of humming, childish humming, came from within. Jeremiah simply said, "The boys are sensitive to light." Soon, no one asked questions. The Holloways remained undisturbed, locked in that decaying mansion with their secrets and their silence. But the midwife, Ruth, dying of fever 5 years later, confessed one final horror. On the night she left the Holloway house, she turned back for her boots and accidentally glimpsed what she should not have seen. The twins, once limp and lifeless, were now sitting upright in the crib, eyes closed, but grinning in perfect unison. Their teeth were not baby teeth, and they were moving their fingers slowly, in patterns, like someone playing an invisible harp. Ruth left the boots. She never told a soul, until the fever took her, and her final words, overheard by a nurse, were, "They weren't dead, they were waiting," and someone brought them back. By the time spring unfurled over the hills of Vermont in 1868, melting the thick shroud of snow that had entombed Holloway House through that godless winter, the town had begun to whisper louder, more boldly, as though the thaw had loosened not just ice, but inhibition, and yet no one dared ascend the hill where the Holloways lived, not even out of idle curiosity. Something hung above that house like an invisible noose, not a smell or a shadow, but a feeling, dense, wet, and watchful, like breath on the back of the neck in an empty room. The servants were the first to show signs. They didn't scream or cry or run, not at first, but slowly, like wood rotting from the inside, they began to wither. One by one, housemaids left in silence, pale as fog, their lips cracked from murmuring to themselves through the night, claiming that they could no longer endure the sounds, the impossible, rhythmic sounds that came from the nursery after midnight. Soft crying, but not in human tones. Lullabies hummed in harmony, but layered as if sung by voices too small, too old, and too identical to be explained away as a grieving mother's delusion. One servant, Eliza Marin, wrote in a letter that she had opened the nursery door one night against her better judgment and seen Esther sitting in the rocking chair, her gown soaked with something dark and sticky, holding nothing at all in her arms, yet rocking as if her life depended on it, her mouth stretched in a smile too wide for sanity, whispering to empty air, "Shh, now, boys, not yet, not yet." But what disturbed Eliza more was not Esther's madness. It was the two tiny depressions in the twin cribs, as if something with weight had been lying there, had recently risen, and had left behind not warmth but cold, a cold that clung to her fingertips for days and blistered her tongue when she dared to describe it. Esther, once shy and soft-spoken, was now only seen in glimpses, drifting through halls barefoot, mumbling phrases that sounded like songs played backward, and sometimes walking straight through the rain without an umbrella, smiling as if baptized in something divine and deadly. The town children began dares, games they called them, of climbing the hill at dusk and counting how many times the nursery light blinked on and off before retreating in fear. They always counted twice, exactly twice, never once, never 3 times, just 2, like a pair of eyes opening and closing behind the curtains. One boy, Peter Holcomb, swore he saw 2 identical handprints on the inside of the glass, as if children were watching him from behind the pane, pressing against it eagerly. But when he blinked, they vanished, and the window was covered not with mist, but with frost, on a spring night. The Holloways refused all inquiries. When the pastor's wife attempted a wellness visit, she was greeted at the door not by Jeremiah or Esther, but by silence and the faint sound of music, music that repeated the same 3 notes again and again, as if something were learning to play from memory. When Father Caraway was dispatched by the diocese to investigate, he entered the house with his collar straight and his faith firm, but emerged less than an hour later shaking like a fever victim, his hair damp with sweat and his voice barely more than a tremor as he muttered, "I don't think they died. I think they were taken," before abandoning his position and leaving town the next morning. He was found dead 2 weeks later in New Hampshire, eyes wide open and tongue missing, with "to still breath" carved in delicate cursive on the inside of his thigh. Yet despite all this, the Holloways insisted the twins had miraculously revived, that it had been some rare and divine recovery, a gift from above. "They're very sensitive," Jeremiah said when the constable questioned him, his face as still as stone, "and they must not be disturbed." But no one ever saw the twins, not once. No doctor visited, no nurse, no nanny. The nursery window was always covered, always glowing faintly at night, and always, flanked by 2 chairs that appeared newly dusted, as if small forms had been sitting there. The only other clue came from the chapel graveyard. Ruth Hembley, the midwife who'd delivered the twins and pronounced them dead, had sworn she'd dug 2 small graves, but they were never filled. Still, every Sunday morning the soil looked freshly disturbed, like someone had been digging, or clawing, or shifting below. No animals would go near the plots, not even stray dogs. And one night, the grave digger, drunk and desperate for warmth, tried to sleep atop the Holloway plots. He was found the next morning twisted in a fetal position, eyes open and frothing at the mouth, murmuring, "They were humming in the dirt. I swear it. They were humming under me. After that, even the graveyard grew weeds. The town tried to pretend. They whispered prayers, avoided the hill, told themselves it was grief, madness, isolation. But there were patterns no one could ignore. Twice a month, precisely at the full moon, and again on the new moon, lanterns were seen flickering from room to room in Holloway House, each movement perfectly mirrored, as though two identical figures moved in tandem through the halls. The kitchen boy from the grocer's shop delivered food and noted the pattern on the pan. Try list. 2 of everything. Never 1, never 3. 2 glasses of milk. 2 buttered rolls. 2 raw eggs left untouched in tiny silver cups. When asked if the children ever came down to eat, the boy only said, "The food's always gone by morning, but the plates are still cold." By the end of the season, the Holloways were no longer discussed in town. Their name became a kind of curse, something you didn't speak unless you wanted the wind to change direction or the crows to scatter from the steeple. But still, people watched the house. And some claimed that on the equinox, when night and day held equal breath, they saw something far worse than ghosts. Something more precise, more sentient. A woman who lived on the far end of town swore she saw 2 figures standing in the nursery window at dawn, childlike in size but impossibly still, not just motionless, but statuesque, like mannequins made of wax, except their eyes glistened, and she could see from that distance that both had bleeding noses, and both tilted their heads at the exact same angle when she tried to look away. "They see you," she said later, "and they don't like to be seen back." That same night, her dog burst through the window and bled out beneath the moon, and when she went to bury him, she found 2 small shoes placed beside the hole, muddy, laced with ribbons, and empty. Always empty. What no one could explain, what no one wanted to explain, was that the nursery had once been filled with flowers. Esther had ordered them in bulk. Lilacs, lilies, baby's breath. But by May, every flower had wilted before delivery. Even in town, the florist said, "I prepare the arrangements, but by the time I reach the hill, they've already died." Nature had begun to recoil from the Holloway estate. Birds never nested nearby. Insects refused the windowsills. Even the ivy on the brick wall stopped growing, curling away from the foundation as if rejecting the very bones of the house. And still, each night, the cries continued, soft, muffled, always at the same hour, never frantic, never desperate, just patient, like the sobs of something that had waited too long to be born and would not accept silence as a tomb. The postman left a package one morning and swore he heard giggling. Not from inside, but from beneath the porch, like 2 small children playing hide and seek. Except the laughter stopped the moment he stepped away. He later fell from a ladder, broke both legs, and was found clutching a piece of parchment in his hand, torn from a children's book with the words, "We're not alone in here. Mommy said we never will be." And he hadn't been delivering to the Holloways. Not anymore. They hadn't received mail in weeks. It was simply left for him, placed where his hand would find it. The Holloways, for their part, carried on, or pretended to. Jeremiah continued his work at the mill, though his beard grew wild and his eyes seemed to stare through people. Esther stopped leaving the house entirely. It was said she had changed, her skin waxen, her hair brittle, her fingers permanently curled into the shape of the cradling. And if anyone dared look closely, they'd see the faint indentations. Tiny claw marks, they said, running up and down her arms as if something small had gripped her too tightly, or never let go. She was once seen in the parlor mirror, not moving, not blinking, as her reflection rocked with two invisible shapes in her lap. But no one ever spoke of it. And when the painter sent to restore the nursery wallpaper was found dead in his home a week later, his eyes sewn shut with fine lace thread and the word "mother" scratched into his chest, the town stopped asking questions altogether. What lived in that house, what moved at night and mimicked life so precisely, was not of nature, nor death, nor even madness. It was something else, something conjured, preserved, and adored into existence. Something born without breath, but kept breathing through will alone. And it was still growing. By the time the leaves turned to rust and fell like flakes of dying fire across the foothills of Vermont in the autumn of 1801, the Holloway estate had grown quieter than ever. No smoke from the chimney, no footprints in the surrounding woods, and no sign of Esther or Jeremiah descending the crooked path into town. But the silence that enveloped the place no longer felt passive. It had become taut, pressurized, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone to finally look too closely. And someone did. Her name was Agnes Fielding, a former housemaid dismissed nearly 3 years prior under cryptic circumstances, who had kept her silence until her mind, shredded by years of nightmares and guilt, began unraveling in public. She stood up in the town church mid-sermon, her face pale and sunken, her eyes darting like those of a cornered animal, and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, that she had seen the Holloway twins not only after their deaths, but during their return. Gasps rippled through the chapel as she recounted what she described as a resurrection, but not of God's making. And what followed was stranger still. She spoke of rituals, of lights that never flickered, of blood mixed with milk, and of 2 cribs filled not with babies but with preserved bodies. Bodies too perfect, too still, their skin hardened like candle wax, their joints bending in ways no child's ever should. According to Agnes, the nursery had been converted into what Jeremiah called the revival room, a sacred, sealed chamber where the twins could be kept not as corpses but as vessels, as if death was merely a hiccup in a longer design. She had seen black candles arranged in mirrored circles, with symbols drawn in salt and ash lining the perimeter of the room. Some ancient, some indecipherable, but all pulsing with a dread that lived beneath language. There was a book, she said, a thick leather-bound tome with a clasp of bone and a cover etched with tiny fingers pressed into the hide, titled in slanted ink, Second Womb. It was not written in English, though Jeremiah read it aloud nightly, chanting strange syllables to the twins as Esther wept and held their little hands wrapped in silk and stitched with red thread as though to keep them from reaching for something they could not have, or something they must not touch. Agnes claimed she saw the twins seated upright in high-backed chairs, their eyes sewn shut with fine lace thread, their mouths stitched but slightly parted, as if whispering secrets to one another in tongues only the dead could understand. Esther would sometimes rock one twin while Jeremiah rocked the other, both parents humming lullabies perfectly synchronized. An echo of a life that had never truly begun. Agnes finally left the Holloway estate when she awoke one night to find both twins no longer in their chairs, but standing at the foot of her bed, swaying gently side to side, their heads tilted inward as if conspiring, and when she screamed, they did not flinch. They only lifted their tiny hands, palms up, and released a sound that was not a cry, not a voice, but the hum of something ancient vibrating through the very bones of the house. She fled barefoot into the woods, her nightgown soaked with the fluid from one of the embalming jars she had accidentally knocked over while escaping, and she never returned. But her public confession, mad as it seemed, stirred something in the townspeople: rage, fear, curiosity, and within a week a group of men, armed with rifles, Bibles, and too much whiskey, formed a search party to investigate Holloway House once and for all. They ascended the hill on October 6th, their breath fogging in the early morning chill, and found the estate exactly as it had always appeared: red, timeless, untouched, but wrong in ways no architecture should be. The iron gate was open. The windows were dark. The front door was slightly ajar, swinging just enough to tap gently against the frame, as though someone, or something, had only just slipped inside. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with a sweet rot that seemed to sink into their skin, and yet there were no flies, no signs of decay, just silence, layered upon silence. The parlor was untouched, the fireplace cold, the furniture coated in a fine white powder that one man claimed was ground bone, though no one stayed long enough to confirm. The hallways were darker than they should have been, even with lanterns, and the wallpaper curled away from the walls like it was trying to flee. They followed the trail of melted wax, thin, deliberate lines leading up the stairs, to the nursery door, which bore carvings they hadn't noticed before. Two faces, small and smooth, pressed into the wood as if someone had pushed them in from the other side, their mouths agape and their eyes missing. One man turned back then, muttering about his dead sister and how she used to sing lullabies to the empty corner of her room before drowning herself in the creek. The others pressed forward. When they entered the nursery, they expected dust, decay, cobwebs, but what they found was heat. The room was warm, too warm, like breath after fever. The fireplace, though unlit, radiated a deep, unsettling heat, and the air shimmered faintly, as though the veil between worlds had been lifted. Two small beds sat side by side in the center of the room, each perfectly made with lace sheets, each flanked by silver bowls filled with black water. Atop the beds were two small figures, dressed in identical white garments, hair combed, lips rosy, and skin flawless, except it wasn't skin. It was wax, or something like it, with the faintest sheen of oil glistening at the temples and under the fingernails. Their eyes were sewn shut, but damp trails lined their cheeks, and one of the men, trembling, whispered, "They've been crying." But the worst part, the part that drove two of the searchers mad and left the others never speaking of it again, was the way the twins' chests seemed to rise and fall, just slightly, just enough to suggest breath, though no breath came. And worse still, the book lay open at the foot of one bed, pages marked with blood and wax and something else, something shifting beneath the ink, as if the symbols were alive and refusing translation. One man reached to touch the book but was pulled back by the group's leader, who swore he heard a whisper, not in the room but inside his skull. Second womb, second chance, second sin. They left quickly, sealing the room behind them, but not before they noticed the chalk symbols circling the floor. New symbols, not faded with time, and 2 fresh sets of tiny footprints leading away from the beds and into the corner of the room, where the wallpaper had been peeled back to reveal a small door they hadn't seen before, barely large enough for a child. They didn't open it. They didn't want to know what was behind it. They fled, sealing the front door, swearing they would warn the town, burn the house, salt the grounds. But by the time they returned 2 days later with torches and clergy, the house was empty. Silent. The warmth was gone. The beds were empty, the diary was missing, and the corner door had been torn off its hinges. Only one thing remained. The silver bowls, now filled not with water, but with teeth. Baby teeth, arranged in concentric circles. No one could explain it. The Holloways had vanished. No sign of Esther or Jeremiah, no trace of the twins, not even footprints leading away. It was as if the family had been folded into the house and carried off like ash on the wind. In the weeks that followed, the searchers who'd seen the nursery began to fall ill, nosebleeds that wouldn't stop, teeth loosening for no reason, dreams of crawling through tunnels that opened into rooms filled with crying that came from beneath, the floorboards of a house no one would ever rebuild. The sound of 2 tiny rocking chairs continued, always in unison, never out of rhythm, as if the lullaby had never ended. The Holloway estate, once a proud but brooding relic atop a quiet Vermont hill, was left to rot in its own silence after the family vanished in 1801. Yet nothing about the place ever truly decayed the way time usually works its will. Wood didn't crumble, glass didn't crack, and ivy refused to take the walls. Instead, the house stood as if time had stopped for it, or perhaps as if it had simply stepped sideways into another current of existence altogether, untouched by weather, by wind, or by the onward march of normal life. For nearly a century, it became a ghost on the hill, the kind of place children dared each other to throw rocks at but never approached. The kind of house adults whispered about only after 3 drinks too many, their voices low and their eyes always flicking toward the woods beyond town. No real attempt was made to purchase it, demolish it, or even map it. Something, instinctual, ancient, kept people from interfering. That is, until 1963, when a group of paranormal investigators from the Northeast, led by Der Emery Fenn, former professor of metaphysics at Yale and author of The Breath Beneath the Grave, arrived to finally break the silence. They were skeptics, at least officially. Fenn and his team of 4 had prided themselves on exposing fraudulent hauntings, debunking demon houses, and untangling centuries of folklore that preyed on rural superstition. But they underestimated what they were walking into, because Holloway House was not folklore. It was something much older, much quieter, and much more patient. On September 9th, they breached the threshold. The air inside was thick, unmoved by the door's opening, as if sealed in a vacuum for 92 years. They brought cameras, tape recorders, EMF, meters, infrared thermometers, and a reel-to-reel audio unit built for radio stations. none of them worked correctly inside the house. Batteries drained instantly. Compasses spun, and the temperature inside the nursery remained at a constant, uncanny 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Body temperature. The room had not changed. The wallpaper was slightly faded, but still intact. The two cribs were exactly where they had been seen in 1871, now empty but with faint impressions left in the bedding, as though someone had just risen from sleep. The silver bowls once filled with water or teeth or ink, depending on the story, were clean, polished, and undisturbed. But the strangest thing was the smell. Sweet, like almond oil and milk, the scent of something preserved too well for too long. One investigator, Lena Rollins, approached the far crib and found a long blonde hair tucked beneath the pillow, tied in a bow. Another, Robert Mathis, reported hearing a music box playing, twinkling, off-key, mechanical, but no music box was found. Emery Fenn, usually composed, was caught on camera seated in the rocking chair, rocking slowly, whispering lullabies to nothing at all, tears streaking his face in long, symmetrical trails. He did not remember doing this. The footage, which was supposed to be archived in Fenn's university vault, was never publicly released, because the team never turned it over. Weeks after the expedition, Lena was hospitalized for a psychotic break, claiming her newborn son was not hers and kept pointing to his reflection in mirrors, insisting there were two of him. Robert disappeared from a roadside motel, leaving only two tiny handprint tags on the inside of the bathroom mirror. And Emery Fenn himself died in 1965, reportedly of heart failure, though his autopsy revealed fingernail scratches inside his throat. Only one piece of the investigation remains in public hands. A torn page from Emery's journal which reads, "They are not ghosts. They are not dead. They are desire. Shaped, sculpted, sung into something that should not be." After that, Holloway House was declared condemned, but no one ever demolished it. The demolition crew arrived in 1971 but fled within hours, leaving behind cranes, wrecking balls, and an entire tool shed still locked and untouched. They said the house changed when you looked away from it. Windows multiplied, doors reappeared, and once a worker swore the house breathed, exhaling just as he struck its foundation with a sledgehammer. That worker died of internal bleeding 6 days later, and his autopsy showed all his ribs had cracked inward, as if crushed by two small arms. Over the years, thrill-seekers and occultists began sneaking in. Film students, ghost hunters, Satanists, even a medium from Connecticut who claimed to channel the Whispering Sons. Most didn't return. Those who did spoke of reflections in mirrors that didn't match their movements, lullabies playing on radios that had no batteries, and the overwhelming sense of being watched not by eyes, but by memory itself. Some claimed to see children, twin boys, pale, grinning, dressed in lace, but always from the corner of the eye, always behind glass, and always vanishing the moment attention turned to them. The most chilling accounts were not of sights or sounds, but of symmetry. People experienced time looping in mirrored cycles, watches ticking backward in perfect sync, footsteps echoing twice, voices mimicking their own in delayed repetition. One visitor, a poet named Annabelle Crane, recorded in her journal, "They are not haunting us. They are rewriting us, one twin for the soul, one for the shadow. Her body was found beneath the nursery floorboards in 1980, perfectly preserved, her hands curled as if cradling something. Nothing. Her eyes were wide open, her pupils shaped like hourglasses. In the decades that followed, a Holloway house passed through ownership of shell corporations, often sold, never occupied. Property records list the buyer in 1984 as E. Holloway. But no such person could be located, and the deed was signed with what appeared to be two identical fingerprints. In 2006, a pair of urban explorers live-streamed their night in the Holloway nursery. The footage, pulled down after 3 hours, briefly showed both explorers frozen in place, eyes open, mouths slack. As a lullaby played, and two childlike figures flickered into view behind them. Reflections in a mirror smiling and placing a finger to their lips. Their bodies were never recovered. Their van was found parked in front of the gates, still running, with two small, lace-trimmed booties placed neatly on the dashboard. The legend grew online. The twins became myth. The Holloway brothers, they were called in Reddit forums, creepypasta stories, and conspiracy threads. Some said they were demons. Others said they were created, not born, through grief and obsession, shaped by Esther's love and Jeremiah's will into something that refused to decay. But the diary, the original diary, the one found and lost and found again in 2021 during a digital estate sale from a Vermont lawyer's private collection, confirms what's always been the most chilling truth. They were just boys. Just two children born without breath, but granted movement by a force no parent should ever dare invite into the crib. The final entry, written in a careful hand with smudged ink, reads, "The stitches come loose. They cry more often now. They know words. They ask for others. They want to be known." Since then, reports have increased. Double shadows, twin handprints on fogged mirrors in homes far from Vermont, children singing lullabies they were never taught. One family in Oregon, unrelated by name or history, found their twin sons waking at exactly 2:07 a.m. each night, staring at the wall, whispering, "We remember the other womb." A girl in Tennessee claimed her imaginary friends were the cold brothers who live in the mirror, and when asked what they say to her, she replied, "They say we were dead, but we learned how to stay." Museums avoid accepting any Holloway artifacts. Private collectors report music playing from unopened boxes. And across the world, stories continue, always in pairs, always at night, always with the unmistakable sense that something, somewhere, is reaching through time not to haunt us, but to double us, to replicate, to be born again through us. It is not death that haunts Holloway House. It is persistence. The kind of love that curdles into obsession, into devotion so profound it no longer requires the body to continue. The kind of twinship that does not accept loss or limits. The kind that waits, sings, and stitches itself into bloodlines. And in the end, perhaps the most chilling truth is this: the twins never needed to leave the house to continue. They only needed us to open the door. As one final page of the family diary reads, barely legible under dried wax and faded ink, "Born dead, yes. But death is not the end. For love, for blood, they stayed. and they remember how to be held.